For my fifth project, I decided to repair and reshell my broken PS4 DualShock 4 controller. The main problem with this controller was the faulty L2 trigger, which my brother broke during a heated FIFA match and then graciously decided to give to me. As you can see, the hinge is completely broken off and needs to be fully replaced. I also figured that if I was going to take this controller apart, I wanted to add a new twist to the boring blue it originally came in, so I ordered a replacement shell in this cool holographic color. In this video, I show you each part in a short explanation of the functions, my cleaning process, my repair and reshell process, and a final test of the controller to see if it works. So first off here, we have the body of the controller, which is just two plastic pieces, the front shell and the back shell. This is one of the older PS4 controllers, specifically model number JDS011 as indicated by the circuit board. The major difference is this plastic piece here that interlocks to the back shell on the left of the speaker holes as opposed to the right like the newer generation of PS4 Slim controllers. Next up, we have the enclosure for the center of the controller, which is this black plastic frame here. We've got our dual analog sticks on the front, our USB-C port and headphone port, and in the middle there is a speaker. There's a printed circuit board on the front, and you can see the circles are for the button inputs. On the top we have our L1 and R1 triggers. Lastly, on the front we have our two vibration motors on the left and right grips. On the back is where the battery is located, as well as the battery enclosure and another printed circuit board underneath. The L2 and R2 trigger buttons are up here, and there are several small openings for connector ribbons to go into when the controller is fully assembled. Now, let's move on to some of the smaller pieces in this remote, namely the buttons and the lighting. This is the micro USB. It's another printed circuit board with an opening for a micro USB cable, as well as a ribbon that will connect to the controller and power the light inside. The LED panel has no hardware, but it is several pieces of plastic supported by foam to keep them together. This rests above the micro USB and uses the power from the main circuit board to emit a light. It goes right here on the top of the controller in this triangular gap. This is the touchpad that goes on the front of the controller. It has a connector ribbon at the top and comes with another printed circuit board and a piece of white plastic to keep everything together. This is the PlayStation menu button and its rubber pad. Like the action buttons and D-pad, the rubber piece allows the buttons to connect to the input board and bounce back up. It's placed on the front of the controller right here. Next up, we've got our menu buttons that lie on either side of the touchpad at the top. This is the broken L2 trigger and the R2 trigger that are going to be replaced. The left trigger has a broken hinge preventing it from hitting the button input, and a broken piece is now stuck inside the controller. As you can see, I've already tried fixing it with glue, but it did not adhere correctly and instead left some residue due to the shiny plastic. These are the new triggers that have both prongs as well as new springs. These are the action buttons and the rubber pad, which all go on the right side of the controller in this circular shape. Adjacent to the action buttons is the D-pad, which goes on the left-hand side, also in a circular shape. Before I repair the controller, I'm going to clean the pieces as some of them were quite dirty. I'm starting off with the back shell as the front shell is going to be replaced with a new one. To clean, I'm using some rubbing alcohol, compressed air, wet wipes, toothpicks, and cotton swabs. I'm beginning by using compressed air and a precision nozzle to spray the inside of the shell and blow away smaller pieces of dirt or dust in the larger areas. I then go into the crevices with a cotton swab and some rubbing alcohol to loosen up any caked on debris. Lastly, I'm finishing up by wiping the back of the shell down with a wet wipe to clear away any oil stains and grime. The internal part of the controller is pretty delicate, so I'm starting off by gently swabbing the printed controller and carefully plucking any hairs or dirt from the adhesive using some blunt forceps. Now I'm just cleaning the front joysticks with a cotton swab and some rubbing alcohol, as there was a lot of caked up dirt above and below. Here I'm just removing some debris from the vibration motor as well as swabbing the top triggers. The broken piece from the L2 trigger would not come out using my forceps, so I switched to my pliers. After that, I gave the area one last swab and the internal component is clean. Now I'm going to move on to the smaller components. The main ones that I want to focus on are the rubber pads, as there's a lot of dirt, dust, and hair sticking to them. Things like this touchpad won't be too big of a deal as there's only a little bit of buildup on the sides. The D-pad also has a lot of buildup. The only things I won't be going over are the micro USB, as well as the LED panel, as they aren't dirty at all. Here I'm moving straight into cleaning the D-pad. I start off with forceps to remove any stray hairs. Next, I'm going in with a cotton swab and some rubbing alcohol to pick up any of the dirt that's left inside. On the D-pad, I first used some compressed air to dislodge any of the dust in between the cracks. Next, I go with a toothpick and dislodge any caked on debris. Lastly, I clean the piece off with a wet wipe and it's good to go. Now onto the action button padding. This padding was also quite dirty, so all I did was repeat the same exact steps as previous. Now, when I was cleaning it with a cotton swab, I noticed that the rubber was actually torn. This did end up affecting button performance at the end of the project, but it was nothing too major. For the menu button, I'm removing any caked on dirt with a toothpick and then quickly wiping it off with a wet wipe. The share button and the options button just required a quick wipe down and they were completed. Now that everything has been cleaned, I'm moving on to reassembling the broken trigger. Although only the L2 trigger is damaged, I'm replacing both of them. This part is quite tricky as all the pieces have to be lined up in a specific order. The spring has to go on the outermost hinge depending on which side trigger you are working on. In addition to this, it also has to fit into a slot on the frame of the controller. Then, the hinge has to be clicked into place without disrupting the position of the spring or damaging the controller. Now I'm just repeating the exact same process but on the other trigger. The triggers have been replaced, so now it's time to put everything back together, starting with the front shell and the buttons. This is the front shell that I will be using, which has a cool holographic pattern. First, I'm going to place the action buttons in the correct order with the triangle on top, the square to the right, the circle to the left, and the X on the bottom. Each button has 4 grooves that fit into the slots on the frame. Then the rubber pad goes on top with the black dots facing up. I push the rubber down to make sure that it sticks. The process is the exact same for the D-pad, except it is all one piece as opposed to 4 separate buttons. The PlayStation menu button goes right between the analog sticks, and just like the other 2 sets of buttons, the rubber pad goes right on top. Lastly, I'm putting the share and option buttons on either side of the touchpad slot. As you can see, they all have specific grooves that fit into the frame, so they cannot be interchanged and are fairly easy to place. The touchpad is next, and it has to be hooked underneath the frame so that it can click into place. This connector ribbon with the blue attachment must remain under the bar at the top in order to be placed correctly. Now I'm going to place the internal components into the front shell. I start by keeping the front shell facing down and lowering the internal frame into it, making sure it clicks into place. Then I go in with some blunt forceps and grab the connector ribbon, carefully feeding it through the slot on the middle frame. As you can see, it is a little bit tricky because there is no grip to it, but eventually I got it. Now, the front of the controller is fully assembled. Next up is the back shell, and I'm beginning with the micro USB board. I'm grabbing a small Phillips head screwdriver and placing the micro USB into the slot on the back of the controller. As you can see here, the 2 holes on the bottom half of the circuit board fit onto the pegs on the shell, while the top 2 holes are reserved for the screws. Now I'm just grabbing my screws and placing them into the micro USB board, making sure that they are secure without damaging the circuit board at all. The light panel is pretty straightforward and there are no screws necessary. The first piece is placed on the gap of the same shape above the micro USB. Then, this clear shield is aligned with the triangle and placed on these two black pegs. Lastly, this white guard snaps into place and keeps everything together. The second last step of this assembly is attaching the front and back shell. As you can see here, I'm attaching the connector cable to the motherboard, which will turn the LED light on. Here, I am attempting to connect the shells together. This was by far the most difficult step as it requires both precision and force to click everything back into place, which is hard to do without damaging anything. As you can see, getting the front shell up and over the trigger buttons at the top was really tricky, and I even unhinged the back triggers several times. It took a lot of patience, but eventually the pieces clicked together. Here I am pressing the buttons and triggers to test everything out, and they all work well. The only button that doesn't work properly is the circle button. It is a little deflated due to the broken rubber padding. The final step before my controller is finished is to put the screws back into the back shell. The case used to bulge out a little bit before, but after adding the screws, everything is completely flush. And with that, my controller is finally complete. In order to declare my controller a success, the LED must operate correctly, the controller must connect to the console, the casing must be flush, and the buttons have to function properly. When I turn my PS4 on and press the PlayStation button, the controller connects to the console and the light turns on, which fulfills two of the criteria. All of the buttons seem to work perfectly, as well as the joysticks. In order to check if the previously broken L2 trigger works, I'm launching a game called The Last of Us, which uses the L2 trigger to aim a weapon. When I press the trigger, the character aims, meaning that it works. As I had previously mentioned, the casing of the controller is flush and doesn't stick out at all. Since the controller has met all of the requirements, I can proudly declare that my repair was a success. After a couple of days, the finished remote is complete. I'm really happy with how it turned out, especially because this is my first ever time modifying a controller to this extent. Here are some photos of the completed remote. Some advice that I have for anyone who wants to attempt a project like this in the future is to always keep things labeled and separated. It makes a huge difference when you're looking for the right pieces and ensures that everything is in the correct place. In addition to this, modding a controller can be quite risky. I wouldn't personally recommend modding a brand new controller as a beginner. My main incentive for modding this controller was the fact that I had to fix it, so I would be taking it apart anyways, which is why I also decided to reshell it. However, it is a good beginner project to gain some experience, and I can definitely see myself doing this with any other broken controllers that I come across.